Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and today I want to answer a question I get quite a lot from viewers, which is, why is my rose not blooming? And usually when they give me this question, they tell me, my rose is growing quite nicely, but it's not either giving me the level of blooms that I'd like, or it's not blooming at all. So I answer usually with a bit of a catch-all statement that I have to take apart and break it into questions. The statement goes like this: once well established, a modern hybrid rose is programmed to bloom and repeat blooming once it has the right level, the right conditions, once it is receiving the proper level of care in your garden, and so long as a pest isn't stopping it from doing so. So I put that up on the screen as I was talking because I know it's a mouthful and it has a few different parts there. I think we have to take it down into 5 different parts. The first one is right at the front of the sentence, which says, once well established. What does that mean? Growing roses can be a lesson in patience, but how long should you wait before you consider a rose well established? Well, I'd say a minimum of 1 year. I really don't expect a lot out of my roses in their first year after going in the ground. They have some business to do. They need to grow their roots. They need to start establishing a framework. So in that first year, I don't expect a lot of them. In fact, there are many rosarians who actually disbud their roses in their first year, knowing that's where they should put their energy. Now, 1 year is just a minimum. Some climbers, particularly, and roses that want to build a big framework around themselves, this expression goes, first year sleep, second year creep, third year leap. I don't know if you've heard that one before, but it applies to climbing roses because they can be famously stubborn to build up their wood and build up their framework before they want to go heavy into blooms. So I would just advise patience, but at least a year and perhaps even longer than that. The next mouthful I had in that statement was the package most modern hybrid roses. Okay, so this is true that a lot of roses have been mixed up in their genetics, and the modern ones, the hybrid teas, the floribundas, the miniatures, the shrub roses, the landscape roses, most of those have breeding in them, have genetics in them that program them to bloom profusely. Some don't, and particularly when it comes to some of the older roses, the species roses, the old ramblers, they bloom on old wood. So the rules don't apply to them. If you cut them down low early in the season, like you did everything else, you probably cut off the old blooming wood, and you may actually lose a year of blooms on those. So that may be one reason why your rose didn't bloom, if it's one of these older roses that isn't amongst the modern hybrid roses that repeat blooms. I'm going to give you a piece of advice here, is to go onto the site Help Me Find, I'll put that link down below, and have a look at the profile of your rose. It's going to say in the front page what the bloom cycle of your rose is. Sometimes it says repeat flowering all the way through the season. Other times it's going to say big first flush with occasional later blooms. You need to know this because it's setting your expectations for your blooming. The next thing you can do is there's a tab on that profile across the top where you can go over to user comments or grower comments, and then other people will tell you what their experience has been with this rose. So I guess this is the point of research your rose, know your rose, manage your expectations. This doesn't help you in the case where you don't know what the rose is, but you know, we'll talk about that in a different video. All right, the third big heavy thing in that statement was the statement, once your rose has the right growing conditions. Let's talk about those growing conditions. I talk about them in my videos all the time, but if you've sited your rose properly, that will determine the conditions of your plant. Did you site it in enough sun? Does it get enough sun? If it's too shady, your rose will not have enough energy to produce blooms aggressively. Some roses are better than others at handling a little bit of shade, but if you have dense shade, if you're expecting this to grow where a hosta grows well, no, that's not the conditions for a rose. They need more fuel than that. Second thing is about the soil. If it is too rocky, if it is poorly drained, or if it's alkaline, those are all 3 things that can damage the blooming performance of your roses dramatically. It'll probably damage the growing performance of your roses too, but blooming for sure. Third thing, is it too hot? Is it too hot? Is it too windy? Is it too arid or too humid? Those are conditions you'd have to consider before you blame the rose, blame the conditions. There are limited things you can do about those unless your rose is in a container and you can move it under some shade, or you can certainly up your watering, but those are condition issues. Fourth thing, is it too wet? Is it raining? And sometimes in my climate, we see the roses ball up and fail to open because it rains too much or it's too humid. And finally, I'm going to say if it's too cold, well, that's an obvious one. If you're in a climate like this one and it's snowing or it's too cold, your roses will not initiate flowers. In fact, they start to shut down. Next up, another big area of the statement is the question of whether you are giving your roses enough care, the proper care. So I just break this up into three basic things. Are you watering your roses appropriately? That is, not too much, not too little. They should have a consistent supply of moisture. Are you fertilizing your roses appropriately? Again, not too much, not too little, and certainly not too much high nitrogen fertilizer. If you're feeding it with the same kind of thing you would feed your lawn with, something that's very, very high on nitrogen, and you're getting that lush, lustrous growth on your roses, but you're not getting any flowers, that could be one of the reasons, because roses will do better with a more balanced fertilizer, particularly with something a little bit higher in phosphorus or potassium. Phosphorus particularly will give you better performance on your roses, but you certainly don't want to over-fertilize. Over-fertilizing can damage the roots badly, and it is by far better to under-fertilize than to over-fertilizer. And finally, I'm going to talk about deadheading, which is just something you can do to encourage more blooming on your roses. Once they've done their flush of flowering, if you take off those spent flowers, the rose will redirect its energy back into flowering. Of course, that assumes you have flowers at all in the first place, which if you don't, that's not an issue. But if you do, taking off and deadheading promptly can allow you to get more flowers off your roses. Final question, is a pest stopping your rose from blooming? Now, I leave this to the very back end of the video because I actually think it may be one of the least likely of all of the issues. I actually think that over-fertilizing or poor sighting is far, far more likely to be causing your problem. However, that being said, you have to keep your eyes open for pests. Most of the major pests that will affect the condition of your rose enough to stop it from blooming, you will be able to see coming a mile away. You'll see chewing damage from things like budworm or from rose slug sawfly or Japanese beetle. They'll be present. You'll see them. You'll see the discoloration and deformation and stippling on the leaves that come with spider mites or with chili thrips. So all of those things, you can probably see them coming a mile away. Again, with the foliar diseases, by the time they get to the point where they're stopping your rose from blooming, you will see that in the condition of the plant. You'll see powdery mildew or black spot, heaven forbid, rose rosette disease. So all of these things that you'll see in terms of pests and disease that will stop it, most of them you'll be able to spot a mile away. One of them that you might not be able to, and I'll just mention it in passing here, is something a little more insidious called the rose midge. I'm not going to freak everybody out by saying this. What you need to do is you need to check and see if this is present in your area. Rose midge is something that will attack the early forming buds of your rose. They'll burrow into it, they'll lay their eggs and burrow into it, and then they will stop that bud from forming or opening. So it will basically have all of the buds of your roses aborting, or some of them anyway, far before they turn into flowers. So that can be an issue. Okay, so those are on the pest end. On the disease end, it's your roots you have to worry about. If you have your rose in a poorly drained soil particularly, the roots can take a ton of damage from pathogens because there's too much moisture sitting around the base of the rose. So of course, this is something that will manifest in terms of discoloration of foliage as well. It'll usually show up as a nutrient deficiency, some yellowing along the plant, but that will indicate to you that your roots are not healthy. The other thing that can happen that can mask is exactly the same thing, is over-fertilizing. And I mentioned this in the section on rose care, is that over-fertilizing is far, far worse than under-fertilizing. So if you're pouring it on, trying to get performance out of your roses, you may be doing more harm than good by damaging those roots and making it so it can't take up the fertilizer or the nutrients for the plant, or water for that matter. All right, that's all I had to say on the topic. I hope that wasn't far too dense for you. I tried to break it up as best I could. If you have questions that weren't answered in this, please drop them down below in the video and I'll see what I can do to help.